In the world of business, not all deals are what they seem. Fortunes rise, empires crumble, all with the stroke of a pen. Mergers, acquisitions, hostile takeovers. Welcome to Mergers She Wrote, where we examine strategies and stories behind the biggest deals in business. Because in M&A, the real risks are the ones you don't take. Welcome to Mergers She Wrote. I have a great guest today, Kazem Harfouche, who's the managing partner of Cedar Crest Capital. On our episode today, we talk about how to prepare your business for sale well in advance of the actual exit, how earnouts could impact the purchase price, and what makes Cedar Crest Capital different than private equity. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. Inaugural episode of Mergers She Wrote. So big thank you for being on today generally.
Please go easy with the questions.
So I think we'll just start today with a little bit about what is Cedar Crest Capital? Tell me a little bit about its origin story.
Okay, I'm going to tell you the full story since we have time.
Awesome.
I won't bore you out though. My parents are immigrants, came here a long time ago. Like most immigrants, they don't really want to work for anybody else. My dad scrapped up some cash. He bought a small business, and he ran that himself. And growing up as a kid, I was exposed to that, and I was like, yeah, this is pretty interesting. You know, do I want to be a doctor? Do I want to go be a lawyer? Do I want to go into business? And I was pretty much hooked. And in high school, I Googled, how do I become an investor? And Google at the time said, you got to go do investment banking for a couple of years, and then from there, private equity recruits you, and that's the path. So great, that's what we're going to do. I left high school with 2 years of college done. I all transferred over here locally, ASU, U of A. I figured, you know what, let's just stay close to the family. Let's go to ASU. They had a banking program there called IBIS, which is an amazing program that I was very fortunate enough to get into as a freshman. You know, they take about 13 students out of ASU, and they basically train you to become an investment banking analyst. And at the same time, my dad started having operational issues with his business that he had no clue how to deal with. And I realized, you know what, investment banking will definitely get me to where I want to go, but it's not going to teach me the ins and outs of business, of what actually happens in a company. How do companies fail? How do you turn them around? How do you fix them? And I did a full pivot. I decided to do consulting. So I went to New York City after college. I worked for one of the big consulting firms, and my clients were private equity clients. So it was with the mega funds, and my role there was to do operational due diligence. So before they bought a business, we would come in and we would essentially look at, okay, from an operational standpoint, what savings could we generate? Which, unfortunately, is a fancy way of saying who can we fire? And it was very uncomfortable for me doing that, but at the end of the day, it's what we had to do, what we were hired to do. After doing that for about 3 years, I was like, you know what, I want to go to the other side now. I want to be on the investing side. And I got recruited to join the Najafi companies out here in Phoenix, picked up my bags, moved back to Arizona, joined the Fastlane team, and was with them for about 4 years. And while I was there, I realized the whole world is so focused on AI, technology, e-commerce, digital. I'm not smart enough to keep up with the change in technology. You know, every 6 months it's changing. And we're not going to be able to compete against Facebook, Amazon's, Google's of the world. So we decided to spin out and form Cedar Crest Capital because we realized there's a huge gap in the marketplace. There's all these amazing businesses in this country that are too small for private equity, and we define that as sub 3 million of EBITDA, don't use technology, have been around for decades, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and the kids don't want to take them over because they're not cool enough for the kids. So you have all these amazing businesses where they need a permanent home. They need somebody to step in and purchase them and keep the legacies alive. So that's what we do and what we focus on. We focus on a very small subset of deals in this country, and I think it's a gap that is missing, and we're hoping to fill that.
Absolutely. So when you're targeting the acquisition of businesses in this gap, per se, is it across the United States? Is it outside of the United States? Is it more local?
So when we first started, it was pretty much, Arizona and the neighboring states. We started seeing so many interesting opportunities. Florida, Northeast, Northwest, all over the place. And we realized the gap there was we don't have operating partners in those states to actually run them. So businesses of this size, half of the time the seller is fairly involved, half of the time they have a team in place. For the ones where the seller is involved, we have to replace what they do. So we were passing on businesses left and right just because we don't have anybody in that market to run them. And it was hurting me because these are very interesting businesses. So what we ended up doing was we started reaching out to search funds, because search funds are out there looking for deals every single day. And they may have not done this before, or they might not have the capital to do it. So we say, you know what, let's partner up. Bring us the opportunity. We'll buy it with you. You'll co-invest with us. And you step in to run the business. And that post went viral. We interviewed close to 250 people. So we have almost 3+ operating partners in every single state.
Awesome.
So now we look at lower 48 states. Alaska's a little too far, but we just looked at one. But Alaska's a little too far, and Hawaii, we'll just have too much fun if we go to Hawaii all the time.
Good excuse.
Yep.
So backtracking a little bit, you said that your father scrapped up some money and bought his very first business, which ultimately was the catalyst for what has become now Cedar Crest Capital. Yep. What was that first business that he bought?
The first business that he got into was actually a jewelry business in Old Town Scottsdale.
Nice.
He did that for a year. He absolutely hated it. His neighbors would just undercut prices against each other for the same product, and he was like, I'm out. And then he went to Sacramento, opened up a bagel store there.
Bagels, I love it.
Bagel, and then he did a souvenir store in Old Town Sacramento. Then he came here, Tisa Luigi's Pizza in Tempe, and then got into the car wash space before it was a hot space, and that's when I think that's where he learned the most and probably made the most of his earnings, and that's when his mindset changed about how he should be looking at businesses.
When he owned the car wash?
Yeah. So as a kid, I was getting real-life business lessons from him. And being a business owner is extremely difficult. I used to see his stress. He wasn't sleeping well, staying up all night. Personal guarantee stressing him out. Right? If you do one mistake, he lost his house. We lost our house. So I got to see that pressure. People think buying a business and running is very easy. It's probably the hardest thing you could ever do. Because you have your employees' lives at stake, right? They rely on you to perform, and your family relies on you. And at the end of the day, if you don't perform, the bank will take everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so we saw that stress firsthand, and surprisingly, it didn't scare me away from wanting to go down this path, but here we are.
No, that's interesting you say before it became a hot space, because I do think the mindset, and maybe this is part social media influencing, but the car wash space has blown up, and it's crazy now how commoditized the car wash scene is, right? Because originally, I remember being younger, and it's like you pull up and it's a flat fee, there's no subscription.
Yep.
And then everyone learned that subscription-based car washes were a way to make more money off of your
Yep.
car wash location. So that's fascinating. But I think you made a really good point, which is that, I think a lot of smaller business owners think that the pressures of operating their business as a solo or a small team has sometimes crushing pressure. But think about when you grow exponentially and all of a sudden, like with a personal guarantee or you having a whole team of employees relying on you, if your business flounders for a period of time, what does that look like for your personal life and for the life of all of your employees? So I think that was a really good point to make. And I think something that people don't realize, that as you grow, so does the stakes at play.
Yeah.
So you touched on this earlier about how you fit this niche area where you're kind of slipping in where there's maybe not as many potential buyers to fill this gap. And you mentioned a little bit about how private equity doesn't really fit into that space. Can you go into it a little bit more as a potential buyer of these, more traditional businesses, how you're different than private equity?
Yeah. So PE is starting to come downstream. We're starting to see them a little bit in our space. Which is scary, but also we welcome competition, so we're excited for it. But we're completely different from private equity. Let's break it up in two pieces. There's the before the deal side, and then there's after the deal side. So the before deal side, PE, they have outside money, they have outside investors. That requires them to do crazy due diligence. They ask for maybe 1,000 items in due diligence, and only 15 of those 1,000 are actually important for the deal. The other items are just to check their box, because in the event they buy this company and they're wrong and they get sued by their investors, they can prove in their lawsuit that they actually did the proper due diligence. Unfortunately, small business owners don't know what a quality of earnings is. They don't know what these items are that big PE firms ask for. And it ends up burning out the sellers because the seller is still running their business. So now if they're answering to 1,000 questions and 1,000 items and they're also trying to run their business, and let's say the PE firm decides, hey, we're going to walk away, that business has tanked during that due diligence period because they've taken their head away from what's actually at stake to focus on these random requests that are not necessary. So that's on the pre-deal side. PE firms tend to be a lot slower in the transaction closing process and much more tiring. So for us, we have one single LP, but it's essentially internal family money at this point. I've worked with them for a handful of years. There's a level of trust there. So we approach it from the sense of, we don't have outside money. We'll ask you the 15 items that actually matter. You're dealing with the decision makers directly. There's no investment committee that we have to report to. So we can close a deal within 45 days from start to finish, which is pretty quick.
It is quick.
In the investing world. PE, I'd say typically, yes, there are some PE firms that can be quick, but typically they're 60 to 120 days on average, which is a long period of time.
I would agree with that.
And that's on the pre-close. On the post-close, I would say it's even more important. Private equity, their model is, hey, we're going to go and we're going to buy this business, and we're going to sell this in 5 years because that's when we have to return capital back to our investors. We have to grow this thing 10% per year. And unfortunately, forced growth is very risky to a business. You're either going to fire people to boost up profitability, which hurts a business, or you're going to inefficiently spend money on marketing R&D, which is a bet that may or may not pay off. If it pays off, great. If it doesn't, you just burn through all these resources. And at the end of the day, they are going to sell the business, which means that brand might disappear. Those employees might not be taken care of. Our model is, if it's not broken, why break it? The business has been making great cash for a long time. All we want to do is cash out that founder or family, put somebody in place to maintain how it's been historically, and that allows us to keep the employees forever, keep the brand forever, keep that culture intact. And the way that we make money is from the distributions of the profit the business has been producing historically. We're not saying we're anti-growth. We're saying we're anti-forced growth. If the business happens to grow, great. If it doesn't, we sleep well at night. And that's what allows us to keep the business forever. And we don't have to return capital back, in 5 years like a typical private equity firm. So it allows us to really focus truly on the long term. And the hardest part of our job is finding a good business or good people, hands down. So why do you want to sell it in 5 years once you find something you like? We don't want to. We want to keep it forever. So that's what makes us a little bit different.
I like that. I think a lot of people don't realize the disconnect between, like you had mentioned earlier, wanting to preserve your legacy, but maybe not having the family members to do that. And you're right. There's a lot going on right now where kids aren't interested in buying the boring business from mom or dad.
They want to do the tech stuff.
No, yeah, they want to do the cool. They want to be influencers. They want to do the easy button. And obviously that's not always the case, but I think unfortunately you get a lot of unsexy businesses that are cash flowing really well, and they don't have the family members to take them over. And so in some instances, they do get sold to, private equity groups that perhaps don't have their best interests at heart. And so, I think at the heart and soul of every business owner wanting to sell, that has that, blood, sweat, and tears invested from, long time ago, cashing out is a big part of that equation, but also maintaining the legacy that you built and seeing your business continue on and supporting those employees that have seen you through thick and thin. Yep. That can sometimes get lost in translation. I liked that you also talked about the due diligence process for private equity, because I don't think people really know for starters, right? They don't always know that that's part of the process, but they also don't realize just how cumbersome and, quite honestly, a little ridiculous the number of questions. I'm going through a transaction right now that has private equity on the other side, and they have asked the same question about 3 or 4 different ways, and my client has kind of looked at me and said, why? I've answered this question, and I'm like, that's just how this goes, right? Just just regurgitate your answer. Yep. They're regurgitating their questions, which will go in a big circle. But I like that you gave context in the background of why that is the case, right? It's checking off of the boxes, right, as part of their process.
Backstory on that, my dad had a business that he was selling probably a few years ago. Private equity approached him, and I'm his quasi-banker. I help him out when I can. And they asked for 1,000 items, and one of those being, quality of earnings from EY, which is, one of the big four. And my dad's business, he's a small business. It's not a big business. And he comes over to me, he's like, hey, what is this? What's this QOV thing from EY? And I was like, we're done talking to him. We stopped talking to him. We cut it off. They were just going to kick the can down the road and just waste his time. And a strategic actually stepped up to the table and understood the industry and was able to ask, 15, 20 items and got the deal closed. There are very friendly strategics, and there are, not friendly strategics, which we can hit on, later on in this conversation.
No, I like that. So, I like this idea of holding on to a business for a period of time until maybe it makes sense at some point in the future. And this idea of continued growth, not necessarily forced growth, especially because I think a lot of business owners, they miss the connection if there is an earnout, right? There's something tied to post-closing performance. If, say, private equity were to come in and make the purchase and there's an earnout tied to it, what is their forced growth plan ultimately going to do? Granted, at first glance, you're probably like, oh, the forced growth is going to just cause my earnout to be amazing. But to your point, what are they going to cut in the process? What are they going to change in the process that ultimately might negatively impact the EBITDA in the following years? And I mean, you see, things firsthand in the field, but also you hear of stories in passing about, companies beginning, even not private equity, right? Outside of that, people coming in and blowing up existing processes that are in the business that are doing well just because they don't like how it's done, and all of a sudden the earnout is completely gone or wiped out.
So growth and change are very risky to a business. In some ways people preach if you don't change, you're going to end up killing your own business over time. That's why what we focus on, tech can't disrupt it. So if we don't change anything, it's not like some new technology is going to come in and disrupt this business next year. We can maintain how it's been performing, and we'll be okay. And that's what allows us to be comfortable with, okay, we don't have to go in here and blow things up to stay competitive. We can maintain the culture, the employees, the brand, everything as is. But back to your question of, forced growth, change, PE coming in, they have to grow this. It's a bet. Some cases they might do very well, and they might grow this thing and everyone might be happy. And in other ways, they're taking a risk, right? Anytime you make change to something that's already been working, there's a risk you could break it, and it happens a lot. So that earnout definitely is not going to be hit. And if they rolled equity over, the equity is probably also going to take a hit. But that's what happens. And we tell everybody, look, they sit across the table from us. We talk to sellers all the time. They're like, what would you do? What's your strategy with this business? And I tell them, I would be an idiot if I sit here and tell you, because I don't know. I have to go into your business, give me 6 months to learn it, and then from there, I'll tell you what I think, where we can go with this. And you have strategics and PE firms come all the time, say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to fix this.
Yeah, how do they know?
They don't know. I mean, they're going to know more than the owner who's been doing this for 40 years. So we just tell them straight, we don't know. I have no clue. What I do know is I want to keep everything you have in place, and then if we find some sort of opportunity, then it'll come up, but it won't be on day 1, day 60, 6 months to a year type of thing.
So as a potential buyer in the market, and as a listener who's maybe a business owner, they would, of course, want to know what businesses are you potentially targeting as a potential buyer out in the market, and what makes those businesses particularly advantageous or something that you look at and you're like, we need to buy this ASAP?
So I think a lot of investment firms are so focused on chasing elephants. They're trying to hit a home run. We're going after singles. We are focused on non-digital businesses that have been around for a long time. We don't like spikes in growth. We want consistent earnings that have been around for a while. There's a proven history there. We want the business that's been around for at least 10 plus years. And for us, the most important questions we ask us, can this business run without the owner? Meaning, is the owner a key person in the business? Are they head of sales, the head engineer for a certain product? Or is it more they're taking care of their employees, taking care of the customers, dealing with the typical business things that we can replace? That's certain type of things we look for. There's a framework we like to use, and we're going to give you some little confidential stuff here on the podcast. One, can Amazon replace this business? 2, has this business been around for 10 plus years? 3, is this a simple business to understand, meaning low to no technology? 4, can you predict the cash flow? It must have a repeat customer base. Here in this state, we have a lot of contractors, construction, which are great businesses, but the problem with those, you're always chasing the next project. So for us, it's difficult. You're always chasing the next customer, and we don't want to be in that type of business. But there are other folks that make a lot of money doing that, and that's their specialty, just not ours.
Okay, so not trades.
Not trades.
Not digital.
Yep.
You like brick and mortar.
Yeah.
Maybe.
When people say brick and mortar, I think of like a retail store.
Okay, we don't have to use brick and mortar.
Business services, consumer services, light manufacturing, niche distribution, healthcare services. Those are areas where we feel like there's a lot of non-digital opportunities, businesses that have been around for a long time, and businesses that we need. There's a lot of businesses out there that people don't necessarily need that produce good cash flow, but at some point in time, they might get cut off. I'll give you some businesses that we've looked at historically that we really liked. There was a police car manufacturer. We worked on that one.
Yes.
It is a project-based business because you have to make the police cars, but those municipalities are coming back to you every 3 to 4 years. So in a sense, you have a repeat customer still. And that's a great business because you're always going to need that no matter what's happening in the world. And so that's one of the things, right? Technology can't really change that. These are highly customized, so you can't put them on an assembly line, right? Every municipality has their own requirements for what they want. So that was a very interesting one. Metal plating is one that we're involved with right now, that all they do is they coat parts that go into commercial planes. So you're always going to need that, especially with what's happening in the world. So things like that, things that people may not necessarily think about. There's a business that we are looking at now in California. They actually create the ICU for you at home. So let's say, you were born with a complication and you're in the ICU. They will actually set up the whole ICU system in your house.
Cool.
So that you don't have to be in the hospital and the family can be with the child at home.
Nice.
And that's a business that you'll always need.
Yeah.
And it's solving a problem, and it's one that gets us excited. So things like that. Trades are tough for us. Construction is tough for us. As long as it hits those 4 criteria, it's something that we'd probably be interested in.
Okay. We talked a little bit around the idea of businesses that have key man syndrome, or, to make it more PC, key woman syndrome, potentially. But the idea, right, being that there's one owner, and without that owner, the business really ceases to exist or would run into some big operational issues. Now, you're, in a lot of times, coming in and adding an operator to the business. Is that a way for you to sidestep the key man syndrome, or do you feel like no matter what, if someone is experiencing that sort of key operator issue, it's almost impossible to overcome? It
depends. Well, we put an operator in place to replace whatever the owner was doing. It's really for handling payroll, handling, P&L, making common sense business decisions, dealing with the employees, making sure they're taken care of, making sure that the customers are taken care of. That anybody with some sort of business knowledge can do. Where we don't touch is if the owner is, the head sales, responsible for all the relationships, where then we don't know, are those clients loyal to the business or loyal to you? And we don't know. We can maybe find out in due diligence, but it's a bet. So those are the ones where, quite frankly, we just walk away, unfortunately. And if you're strategic and you're in the space, maybe they can get comfortable because they're already in the industry, right? They can bring in one of their team members who's an expert in this space, who has relationships. That's different. But from our standpoint, it's very hard for us to replace what the owner is doing.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we have to pass on a lot of stuff for that reason. And we tell folks all the time, bring us in early enough we can tell you what to do and what to improve and what flags that other people might look out for. And then they have time to kind of work on that and bring in the right people, transfer that knowledge over.
Get some SOPs in place,
Yep.
standard operating procedures. No, I appreciate that because I don't think it's black and white. And I think in a lot of instances, if you do get to somebody in advance, I talk a lot with clients who are planning 4, 5, 6, 7 years out, right, from exiting. And, the conversation always revolves around what can I do to prepare and plan? What am I not doing?
Yep.
And one of our, the questions I like to ask is, can you take 2 weeks and not take a phone call, not take an email, right? Because almost 99% of the time, the owner's like, my business would blow up, or there would be things that go wrong, or the idea of stepping away wholeheartedly for 2 weeks and going radio silent is an impractical part of their business. So I think it tends to highlight that key operator syndrome issue. So I think as a business owner, a follow-up question that I would want to ask is, if you're putting in these operators post-closing, and let's say I don't have a key operator issue, maybe I have some stuff that I need to hand down, but I can do that with certainty. What does it look like for me post-closing working with you guys? Am I on a consulting basis with you? Am I transitioning for 30 days? Is it more long-term? Or is it really depending on the type of business and obviously the operator's involvement?
We like to, obviously for everything it depends, but we like to ask for 2 months.
Sounded like an attorney.
I'll protect myself. You've taught me well. We need typically 2 months transition period. That's just us with you, side by side, trying to absorb as much as we can. And then from there, we'll have a consulting arrangement where if something comes up, we'll pay you for your expertise. But we don't require them to stay on board for a year or 2 years, which you hear in a lot of private equity transactions. We truly want to be an out for you. We want to be succession plan for you. And that's what we stand by. So give us 2 months and then go off into Hawaii and do whatever you want. We're not going to keep you for 2-3 years. At that point, just keep the business.
Yeah.
Just make all the profit to yourself.
Well, and I think, too, a lot of people who are at that stage where they want to cash out of their business, they're ready to be retired, right? And so this idea that, private equity or not, being kept on board for a year or more in some instances is not optimal. Or maybe their health is not in the best place and they can't physically be on board for a year or two. And so I think that it's something that every business owner doesn't really consider until the LOI hits their desk and all of a sudden there's a 2-year potential contract for them.
Something we tell a lot of people, a owner will have a very hard time becoming an employee. So if you're going to ask them to stay on board for a year or 2 years, they're now an employee, right? And there will be clashing, there will be fighting, and there will be disagreement on stuff. And they're not wired like that. They're entrepreneurs. They built this company from the ground up, and that's what they've done for 30, 40 years. So for you to tell them to stay on board to be your CEO or something, it just sounds very messy. It's not going to work.
Well, it's like the equivalent when you hear about publicly traded companies removing their their CEO, or I forget, it's like the president or CEO, and they swap them into a role that is more a consulting, advising role. They're not actually handling the daily operations.
Like executive chairman.
They
take the CEO, they make him executive chair.
You're still part of the business, but you're not really in charge of it anymore. And those always implode because, to your point, they can't take a back seat. They either have to be fully removed or they have to be in a very limited consulting position, which I think they even struggle with sometimes mentally anyway.
Yeah. Something we've realized a lot, and I think we should definitely hit on this. What we do, I say 70% of the time we're psychologists. We're not investors. Because in the segment that we play in, these are first generation business owners. And for them, this is their child. This is their baby. They built this 40 years ago, 30 years ago. This is the most important thing to them. This is their identity. It's extremely important to who they are. And where we have most challenges in the stuff we face is they have a hard time letting go. And it breaks our heart when we hear about sellers, unfortunately, getting ill or something happening to them, and they just shut the doors down. Happens all the time. And now their family left millions of dollars on the table that they could have exited, but sellers wanted to keep working until unfortunately something happened to them, and we are trying to prevent that. So we're out here trying to speak to as many people as possible because we want them to know that, hey, you have this option, right? People don't realize they can sell their business for millions of dollars. They could just like, we're just going to shut our doors, we're going to retire. So it's that psychological angle, which is actually probably the hardest part of what we do. It's not finding the deals. It's not finding them. It's the psychological piece. That's by far the hardest part of what we do.
It's so true.
It's so tough.
So true and so tough, because I feel like there's this window for a lot of business owners where they're still very capable. The finish line is not anywhere in sight, and things are really busy because things are going well, and the idea of carving out time to prepare your business for a sale doesn't exist, or they don't make the time, right? No. And so I think, to your point, having conversations earlier, I think it's a critical component of preparing this sort of handing off of potential generational wealth, right? Yep. And we always kind of just talk in passing about this between myself and my clients, is that, you know, this is not something we're doing, you know, it's almost like estate planning in a way. It's really hard to get people to understand the value of putting together a will when there's nothing wrong. Yeah. But it's the same version of what you do for your business, because one day something could be wrong. And if you haven't spent the time, which it takes considerable time to put in all of that sort of standard operating procedures, all of the sort of the Bible of your business, right? Or whatever you want to call it, your operating manual, that you can then go to as someone outside of the company and be able to page turn through and figure out how to operate it even in your absence. So I really like that idea of being able to have these conversations earlier. I know there are certain pockets of the United States that are seeing more of their businesses just disappear because of this, because they don't know, which is wild to me. Staples in communities that
and
are
all
just,
your employees now lost their
Yes.
job, they're out of jobs, probably lost their insurance. There's not just them, you know, there's other people that rely on them, and I think they forget that sometimes.
Yeah.
So something we've been testing the waters with is, you know, let's say you are maybe 5 years out from retirement. You know, instead of getting the phone call at year 5 when like, hey, I'm done, what if you want to take some chips off the table, bring us in, you know, we'll buy maybe 51% of the business. Therefore, they have some chips off the table. They've de-risked themselves a little bit. Now they can breathe, you know, they have some money in the bank, and they want to run it another 5 years with a partner that we can maybe help them. Have you thought about this? What about this? Have you thought about this? Bring a different perspective. And then in 5 years, when they're like, okay, I'm ready, we're already there, we'll purchase the remaining piece of the business.
I like that a lot.
So that's something we've been testing a lot with recently, because we're seeing a lot of folks that are, you know, maybe to the outside world, it's retirement age, but they still have so much energy and there's so much fire in them, and they just want somebody to come and go through the trenches with them, and we can do that. And it gives us the in, essentially, because in 5 years when they want out, we're already there. We already have a relationship. It makes it easier.
What an advantage. Yeah. Well, and to come in and potentially learn the ins and outs, but also be introduced to key clients or customers or whatever the vendor relationships, right? To have that person be live in the office with you, essentially hand-holding you through this process of phased buyout is, I think, an incredible approach.
Minimizes a ton of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, we both have gone through quite a number of acquisitions and advised from a different perspective in different ways. I'd love to hear a story from the trenches, if you have one for us, that was either a win or something that was a hurdle that just couldn't be overcome, just from the perspective of a potential business owner, to know what are the potential pitfalls or things that could create ripples in the transaction process.
Good question. There's a lot of war stories. Let me decide which one I want to pick on. There was, I guess there's one that I can talk about without mentioning names. You know, we don't like earnouts. We like businesses that are fairly stable and steady. Therefore,
I'm going to pause you in the middle of your story. Okay. Tell everyone why you don't like earnouts.
So earnout essentially is, let's say you believe your business is growing, and we we don't know personally. We don't know what's going to happen, and so we will pay a price based on that future growth. That's the total price, but the cash that we'll give you at closing is a little bit less than that. And if we hit these hurdles, the next 2 years, you will get paid out the total purchase price. So sellers like it because they feel like they have another bite at the apple. Essentially, if things go well, they make some more money. And buyers, not us, but other buyers do like to use that tool because it's a way to bridge a gap in negotiation. For us, we try to be extremely transparent. We are never going to dangle a carrot that we don't think is achievable. And there was a deal we were working on where the business had a spike post-COVID, as most businesses did, and we did not know what was normal. Is that going to reoccur? I keep hitting my mic. Is that going to reoccur the next 2 years? Is that going to reoccur maybe in 1 year? And it was adding too much risk to us, and we could not come to an agreement with the seller on that component. We came to agreement on the total price. We came to agreement on the working capital. We came to agreement on almost everything. And we had a lot of respect for that seller. But on the specific earnout, given the way that the industry was going, if it hit in that first year and then in year two, everything stabilized back to what it used to do, we would have significantly overpaid for that business. And that was a risk to us, and we were not willing to take that risk. Now, if it was a 2-year earnout, we were ready to close the deal. And the only reason we put that earnout in place because the business didn't have the earnings history that we like. And I continue to repeat myself to the seller. If you had history, 3-4 years of earnings at this level, we would pay you all cash at close, and we would walk, and it'd be a done deal. So earnout only comes into play for us when you don't have that historical history. Otherwise, we want to pay you full cash at close. We want to buy as much of it as possible because for us, we're fairly selective in the things that we do. And when we find something we like, we want as much of it as possible. And I think earnout can get messy with a lot of people because then you're going to decide revenue earnout, gross profit earnout, EBITDA earnout. Some people say you can manipulate EBITDA earnout, right? You can put more costs in there, which reduces it. So as a game, you can play revenue. It's harder to play with revenue, but then your COGS can go up, right? Out of your control, inflation can happen. Now your gross profit's a lot less, even though your revenue is hit. So they're messy. We just try to avoid them. You probably have a lot of earnout stories from your deals.
I think earnouts they're really scary for a lot of my seller clients because even though they have historical financials that show that the earnout should be, for all intents and purposes, no problem, the idea that they're not getting the full value of their purchase price if something were to happen post-closing and all of these what-ifs come into play, right? They're no longer at the helm. The buyer could come in and start making changes. And in a lot of cases, the buyer isn't like you guys representing that they're going to not change anything or make these drastic changes. So the biggest concern, right, is that they come in and they wipe everybody out. And so I think that from an earnout standpoint, I've seen the chips fall to the benefit of more of the buyer side than anything because you do have so much variability. And especially, and I know this isn't necessarily an area that you guys specialize in, but I work a lot with professional service businesses. Yep. And even if those services can be performed by, say, another accountant, people love their accountant. They're tied to that person. It's the same with a physician practice. They love their physician.
So I gave you 4 of the criteria. Number 6 was no professional services.
Yes, I forgot that was in your list.
Yeah.
So, I feel like it's difficult when I'm, working with a client that's in a professional service business for them to have an earnout and to sit there and tell them this isn't going to impact you because inherently you have attrition because you are tied to the business in some personal capacity, and replacing you, I think, is an art form. That's a broader conversation that I talk about with my clients is when they're selling and it is based on their, personal relationships with their clients, how can we make that transition a lot less scary? Because inevitably you're introducing someone new to take care of an important part of their life. And I think a stepped approach that, you know, relies, to your point, on psychological aspects where you're introducing people as this is someone who's going to come in, we're going to make this gradual, you're going to get to know them, things to lessen the burden. But to your point, you always have to play a psychological role in this process.
Yep, 100%. You know, something I always tell bankers all the time, they're like, oh, well, you know, post-close, you can change things that hurt the business, and therefore, you know, the earnout is destroyed. We say, well, if you move out, if you remove the owner and the business falls to the ground, do you really have a business?
It's true.
Is it a business at that point?
It's true.
So that's something that we always pitch. You know, if you remove out that one person, the business falls to the ground, it's not a business. You know, they're too involved.
No, absolutely. And I think to your point earlier, you had said there's ways to play with EBITDA where earnout, or essentially the way that the remainder of the purchase price is paid to the seller, is inflated or deflated manually through a calculation that's just all relying on math, right? And I think that one important thing to note is that there are ways to have an adjustment to the EBITDA during the earnout phase to essentially add back in, like you were talking about, management fees and all these things that could be pulled out. And for service-based businesses, especially ones that are in trades, which I know that's outside the scope of what you guys like to do, but especially for them, they tend to have issues with rebates and discounts and all these other things, retention, stuff that's pulled out that needs to be added back in so that your EBITDA and the earnout ultimately is correct.
Yeah, so I guess it just comes down to finding that right formula that it's industry specific, and that's where the lawyers have fun because they get to write out like 3 pages just on a math equation, and, and it gets really messy.
No, I have to say nothing is more mind-boggling than trying to take math and put it in words and have it make sense for all the parties reading the contract.
Yeah, we went through that, and there was I think it was like 2 pages.
Oh my goodness!
Just for the math formula. I'm
That's
over there,
overkill.
and I'm in there sitting like trying to convert it back from words to math, and I'm like, okay,
reverse engineering.
How does this work? I wish I went and got a law degree sometimes.
Well, I feel like you've done enough. We've worked on enough LOIs that I can wholeheartedly say that you've got some savvy, some lawyer savvy in there for sure. Well, I wanted to ask as sort of a final question for you, what's a really great or favorite business book that you've read that you would recommend to a business owner?
So tough.
And it could be in anything. It doesn't have to be acquisition-based or exit planning.
I read a lot. I'm always reading new books, nonfiction, business-related. But the one I read most recently I really enjoyed, it's called Richer, Wiser, Happier. And essentially what it does, it's an interview of, I think, like 7 really famous investors. A lot of them we've never heard of. And it talks about how there's so many different ways to make money, and they just found their niche and they were laser focused on it and they stuck to it. And it may not be the cool, sexy things that everyone's doing with technology. It kind of hit on the head, like we are just going to stay in our lane and we're going to continue to do what we're doing. And people are might talk negatively about it, and that's okay. This is where our passion is, and it kind of solidified that. It was written in a very fun way, and they talk about not just in the business sense, but also in their personal lives, how they maintain both and they stay happy, etc. It was very, very interesting read. No,
that's cool. I think that's probably one of the biggest questions for any business owner is how to balance it all.
It's tough. I think being a business owner, it's really hard. I don't know how you do it. And that's what makes entrepreneurship so fun and so stressful at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you.
In the world of business, not all deals are what they seem. Fortunes rise, empires crumble, all with the stroke of a pen. Mergers, acquisitions, hostile takeovers. Welcome to Mergers She Wrote, where we examine strategies and stories behind the biggest deals in business. Because in M&A, the real risks are the ones you don't take.